Hello and welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Authors Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is taking care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. Books are available through our bookstore, &Books. I'll put the link in the chat. We're so excited to have Alex McElroy with us this evening. First, we'll hear them read, then they'll be in conversation with Emily Hessney Lynch. Emily Hessney Lynch is a social media strategist and owner of Serve Me the Sky Digital. Her short fiction and memoir work has appeared in McSweeney's, Sad Girls, Club Literary, 5 Minute Lit, and Spellbinder magazine. She lives in Rochester, New York with her husband and their dogs. Alex McElroy is a non-binary writer based in Brooklyn. They received their MFA from Arizona State University and their PhD from the University of Houston. Their writing has been supported by the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Tin House Summer Workshop, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and Elizabeth George Foundation. The Atmospherians is their first novel. Explosive and wickedly funny, The Atmospherians peers straight into the heart of wellness and wokeness, self-mythology and self-awareness by asking what happens when we become addicted to the performance of ourselves. The writer Alexandra Kleeman has called Alex McElroy a master excavator of the murky innards that drive us, a satirist with an eye for the tender parts that make us tick. Alex, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Dan, and thank you, Emily, for being in conversation. This is exciting. So I will just jump right in. I'm going to be reading from a section in the middle of the book, and depending on how much time there is left, I might also read from a really brief section closer to the end. There's not much that you need to know at this point. It is the two main characters, Sasha and Dyson, later on in their lives end up starting a cult to reform problematic men. But this is a scene from much earlier in their lives that gives a little bit of a background of what brought them together. Okay. Imagine a father. Imagine the father is firm-fleshed and grim, gripping a steering wheel as he drives to work at 2 in the morning. Imagine the father has been called in on a weekend to the pharmaceutical plant where he sweeps floors and changes light bulbs 5 nights a week. Called in to fix a steam-leaking pipe, a leak that could wait until Monday. Imagine the father has made this long, hour-long drive thousands of times. Imagine he is accustomed to working nights, accustomed to being called in, and really shouldn't be any more tired than the normal person. Imagine the father is not tired in the heavy-lidded physical way, but tired in ways that don't have names. Imagine tiredness as a characteristic. Imagine tiredness as an outfit the father cannot unzip. Imagine a father so angry for having to wear this outfit every day of his life. He spends his rare hours at home taking out his anger by lifting weights in a basement. Imagine a father so unaccustomed to love that he considers mocking his son's belly fat an expression of paternal care. Imagine a father incapable of loving his son how he is. Imagine a father who pressures his son to lift weights and eat fewer, softening foods, who pulls the boy's plate away at the table and grumbles, "That's enough of that." Imagine this father, still at the wheel, now nearly 3 in the morning. Imagine this father driving to work on a weekend to fix a leak that does not need fixing. It is not a dangerous leak. Imagine the highway is free of debris, a dry night in the first week of June. And imagine this father, angry and exhausted, unintentionally loses control of the wheel around a familiar turn. Imagine his truck pummels through a guardrail. Imagine his head webs the windshield on impact. Imagine this is an accident. Dyson's body at age 17. Cola-colored hair hangs to his eyes. He stands a sliver under 6 feet, just tall enough to peer over a fence. His fingers are slender but short. A stove burn shaped like a sickle marks the back of his left wrist. His skin is the color of apricot flesh. Freckles bloom lily pad-like under his eyes. His cheeks are as round and pitted as the rind of a cantaloupe. Acne marches across his shoulders like ants. Pimples prick his collarbones. There are some on his thighs, the small of his back, and the places he sweats where the sun does not dare shine. In the center of his body is a stomach, cushy and round, which he does not consider his own. It belongs to whoever's itching to see it. For laughs, he lifts his shirt on command. Other kids bury pencils and keys and half-eaten muffins into the flab. The red mark of a hand fades on his skin. For a long time, Dyson doesn't object. A week after his father died, on a hot, slurping Sunday morning in June, Dyson waited outside my front door, wearing blue mesh shorts a smidgen too short. His boxers peeked out of the bottom, and a long-sleeved t-shirt with the name of our high school printed across the front. A white headband flattened his hair to his forehead. I blew into my hands, swung my legs to warm up. "I want you to show me how to do it," he said. "You know how to run," I told him. "To show me how to have a body like yours." My body wasn't much of a body. I was flat-chested and tall. I felt all angles and elbows, a body inherited from my mother. My eyes rested unevenly on my face. My ears flapped out through drags of paint-straight hair that stretched past my shoulders. I hated my forearms for reasons I cannot explain. I hated my fingers for reasons I can explain. They were long and elegant, and men loved using this as an excuse to take hold of my fingers, to ask if I played piano. I didn't. My mouth was packed with bright, prominent teeth. I had a fawn-like porcelain beauty, the type that made older men eager and nervous. I never polished my nails. I wore makeup only for the most funereal or joyous occasions. Though my skin wasn't perfect, compared to Dyson, and compared to the rest of our high school, a parade of misfiring hormones, it glowed as if it had never been touched. I'd lucked into my mother's skin, olive-colored and flawless, no need to apply or avoid or rinse the way other people applied and avoided and rinsed. My mother modeled before she was born, not in the type of magazines people imagine when they hear the word model. She posed for Sears and J.C. Penney catalogs, wearing matronly smocks patterned with cartoon irons and kittens and babies. She was forced out of the job after becoming pregnant with me. Her stunted career soured her on the beauty industrial complex, as she called it. She distrusted beauty the way people distrust politicians or exes. Whenever shampoo or makeup commercials came on TV, she would change the channel and scoff, "Someday we'll look back on these poisons the way they do cigarettes and DDT." She considered herself one of those women who didn't care about looks. She intended to let herself age organically and gracefully to become whatever nature decided. However, she couldn't abstain from using beauty products. "You buy the product to become the product," she would mutter, as she led me through cosmetics aisles, loading her basket with lipsticks and eyeliners and serums. She worked as a receptionist at a day spa, a job she hated but took, I suspect, to punish herself for never having made it as a model. The spa kept a shallow wicker bowl full of sample shampoos and cleansers and masks on her desk. At the start of each shift, she emptied the bowl into her purse to protect our clients from poisons, only to later transfer the samples to a bowl on our kitchen counter. Someday I'll grow a spine, she would tell me, as she plucked out packets of pricey bronzer, and throw this trash in the trash. She was among those rare people who were just as tragic as they believed themselves to be. Despite her best intentions and bitterness, she couldn't withstand the expectations imposed on her appearance. And in doing so, she taught me a valuable lesson in the inevitability of concession. The world encouraged me to see myself as an object of men's desires, and for years, I conceded. I shaped myself to the demands made on my body, kept it slender and pretty and fit, because I feared what would happen to me if I didn't. I'd heard stories about the women who didn't. When Dyson said, "Show me how to have a body like yours," what I heard was, "Show me how to internalize the expectations of magazines and commercials and lip-licking men in the streets. Show me how to obsess over myself, to hate myself, to see my body as something both valuable and worthless, something constantly under construction." That was, I believed, what he wanted from me. And regrettably, that's what I taught him. So I'm going to read a bit of a lighter section that comes much later in the book. And this is after Sasha and Dyson have started the cult, actually 5 years into the future. And you're going to get a little taste of how things have gone for them a few years after they have tried out this pretty wild idea. And you're also going to get it not really in the first person voice that we were getting earlier from Sasha. This is actually something of like a found text. Think of it as like what would appear on the website for a corporate cult, essentially. Our mission. The atmosphere began with a simple observation. Men are behaving badly. For thousands of years, men placed themselves at the center of society. Their chase for power, attention, and wealth resulted in massive global disasters. Something needed to happen. Men had to be better. What was needed was a community where men could challenge themselves to step out of the spotlight and into the background, to provide the atmosphere like extras in movies. At age 29, Dyson Lane left his promising career as a film and TV actor to team up with his lifelong friend, Sasha Marcus. Together, they started The Atmosphere, a supportive and secluded environment for men to learn strategies to undergo emotional, aesthetic, interpersonal, and professional transformation. Good things happen when men evolve. Good things for everyone. Dyson and Sasha started The Atmosphere on 15 acres of farmland in southern New Jersey. The first class of Atmospherians were tested by food scarcity, man hordes, and tragedy. Nonetheless, Sasha refused to give up on their vision, and 5 years later, the Atmospherian lifestyle is practiced officially in over 200 nations. Its training has helped resolve pervasive problems many men face, including hostility, envy, loneliness, philandering, catcalling, inconsiderateness, alcoholism, homelessness, sexual misconduct, sexual deviousness, sexual inadequacy, athletic nostalgia, unemployment, paranoia, misogyny, hoarding, dyspepsia, and political ambition. Since the Atmosphere's founding, such miraculous things have happened. Workplace sexual misconduct claims have declined by 87%. Male suicide rates have declined by 79%. Male unemployment has fallen to 1.8%. The man horde epidemic has been eliminated. In our New Jersey headquarters, a revitalized 3-story shopping mall, Atmospherians are taught to recognize and communicate emotions through proprietary psychological exercises. They receive job training in call centers, coding labs, and a carpentry warehouse, where members produce our renowned tiny house kits, available now on our website. Each Atmospherian receives an individualized meal program developed personally by a company algorithm. We guarantee the most responsible and discreet treatment available. Past and current Atmospherians include actors, firemen, senators, dictators, judges, presidents, athletes, doctors, sons, brothers, and dads. Nearly 97% of Atmospherians choose to continue living in an on-site facility after completing the program. If you or a man in your life is struggling to keep up with our rapidly changing society, there is no treatment more effective, convenient, or safe. The atmosphere, where men become human. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
No, it doesn't feel the same clapping on Zoom. Thank you for writing this fantastic book. I enjoyed reading it so much, and I hope that the press and everything has been good for you. It's been a good release year and everything, despite COVID.
Yeah, despite COVID. Yeah, the ultimate caveat. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I want to dive in with the influencer piece of the novel, since Sasha is, almost on the cusp of this major success, and then she quickly becomes disgraced. I'm really curious, in your research for the novel, were there any influencers that really fascinated you?
Yeah, so there were a ton. I mean, mostly it was no one who I feel like most of my obsession with influencers were a lot of yoga influencers, people who I could use to help work out. I don't have much of a skincare regime, so I didn't really go down that route. But there were a lot of yoga influencers who were really interesting to me because they were at the maybe 10,000 to 50,000 followers, in which they weren't absolutely making it, and they weren't the people like the Kardashians, but they were still going at it. And I think that there's a range of people that I saw, not even as individualized people, but I saw them as I see them as almost like middle managers. A book that was really important to my research process is Kids These Days, The Making of Millennials by Malcolm Harris. And in that book, Harris talks a little bit about what he sees as three of the main options for millennials to make it in our society. And the first option is either you are wickedly talented athletically and you end up becoming a professional athlete. The other option is that your parents get you into the best schools from the youngest age, you're super smart, and you go ahead on that level. The third option is that you accidentally go viral. And that's the other way to make money. And I was really fascinated by the people who were trying to accidentally go viral, right? The people who maybe weren't able to make a full career off of it, but were still doing what they could to have some kind of influence that might be able to, and it might not give them a salary. It might only lead to getting a bunch of free forks in the mail or something like that. Rather than actually being able to get money out of this, but you were just getting products that you would later pose with. And people who were continuing to do that seemed really to me this, we have lost the sort of the corporation where we can go and work in for 40 years or whatever. And in lieu of that, we have either be a manager at a Verizon, or, be the sort of mid-tier influencer who has a mild amount of clout, but isn't really a CEO or something like that, hasn't truly made it. So I think it was less individual people than it was the idea of it, and really in the abstract, that I was most fascinated by. And that's absolutely where Sasha is. She's someone who has not fully made it yet, but she's almost on the cusp of that, as you said, before things really go south for her. I will also say that I was obsessed with little Michaela for a while, who is do you know who she is, Emily?
I'm not as familiar with her, no.
She is a CGI influencer.
Oh yes, I've heard of her.
Yeah, and she's just sort of placed into different scenarios with different real people, and it looks so creepy. And it's and she has a whole backstory of she came to terms with herself being made up a few years ago. Yeah, and it's so she was, the drama of Little Michaela was, I was obsessed with that for a little while.
My influencer obsession, the rabbit hole I go down, is usually Caroline Calloway, because she is just such a fascinating character who's himself off of repeated seeming scams, and no matter what she does, she still has people who are willing to follow her, and she just gets so much attention for the lies and scams that she produces on purpose.
Well, that's really interesting. And I think that comes back to something that Naomi Klein wrote about this after Trump was elected. And I think it connected back to her first book, No Logo. And I think it's a question of branding, right? And for Calloway, if her brand is to be a scammer, like what we hate more than we hate scammers right now is hypocrisy. So Calloway, for what she's worth, she's never hypocritical, right? And she's able to, and this is the type of thing that Klein would say that like, so long as a brand can maintain their consistency, they aren't going to lose their followers because people know what they're getting into. And that I think is what's really fascinating about Calloway. Like she just released that skincare line called Snake Oil, right?
Yeah, leaning all the way into that.
Yeah, exactly. Which I
Very
think,
effective for her. Yeah.
yeah, she's doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads nicely into my next point, which is about the humor of the novel. It just made me laugh so many times. It's so funny. One of my favorite parts was Click, the nonprofit that pairs underprivileged children with digital cameras,
Yes.
very important work that they're doing. I'm really curious how you honed and sharpened the satire to the point it was by publication.
Thank you. I mean, I'm glad you found it funny. That's, I think, one of the toughest things is whether or not something is actually funny when you try to make something funny. So I'm glad that that worked. And I will say that the weirdest thing about writing satire for me has been like, I would think that I was making something like totally absurd. Like this would never happen. Like I was in the drafting process, had like written the Click scene, and then I ended up at a fundraiser that was essentially Click. And it was like, and I was like in this room and I was like, oh my God, like I thought that I was like going too far and that this was like an obvious joke, but like, no, like this exists. And the people in this room are like so excited. Like it wasn't to the extreme in which there was like price points based on poverty, as what happens in my novel. But I think when you're writing satire, you can, I think especially in American culture, you have some leniency to lean fully into the absurdity. And oftentimes American culture catches up to you, or it is already there and you just haven't heard about it yet. As for sharpening the satire, I think for me, humor for me is really all about language and about how people talk. And I think I guess I could go back to something that I just read from in that Our Mission. There's a line in there that is like a very small joke, but was like really intentional in crafting it. There's something that is like, I think that their meals are determined by a individualized company algorithm, right? And that I think, which is a like really intentional rhetorical conflict, right? This sense that like, oh, it is individualized, it is personalized, but it is done by a computer, right? And I think that just trying to find those moments of, I think a lot of the fun of writing this book was seeing where language and creating contradictions in language that can produce humor. I mean, for Click, it was, as you said, like pairing underprivileged children with digital cameras, right? Which I think brings in some of the things that are most important to like legitimate concerns about issues that no one is like thinking about, right? Is like, how do we document these things? How do we should get people to care about these things? And I was really interested in grifting. And I think organizations like Click are there to just like be a bit of a grift and to try to sort of take advantage of something that I think has legitimate value. And I think that's also where the humor comes from, is that if I just absolutely hated these things, if I thought that there was like no value in the nonprofit world, then I don't think it would be funny. And I think it would come off as like bitter and cruel. But I think that there's part of me that like has found myself in those rooms and I've been like tricked into thinking like, oh, this is a really good idea, right? Like I'm extremely gullible. I get scammed all the time. And I think that is like, I went to Europe when I was like 22 after college and got scammed in like every country. It was like a whirlwind tour of scams. And so I think that for me has taught me that like, there are these things that might seem like from our like above, like, tennis judge seat, that seem like we can like see everything that's happening. But I think like we're in the middle of it a lot of these things sound pretty cool and we can get sucked into them. And I think being able to capture both the absurdity of it and its, I would say, scamminess was really important to finding some of the humor in it, because I think that just ends up like coming out of those situations. I had something else to say, but I forgot it. So it flew away. Yeah.
We've all been there though. We've all been sucked in.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious with the satire, were there any parts that you had leaned in really hard on the absurd, then you had to kind of pull back, or was it more the opposite where you needed to punch it up even more?
Yeah, I think there were moments when I needed to pull back. And I think what's really important to me is thinking about, I guess, like, there are a lot of conversations now about like who can make jokes about what, right? Like, oh, like I can't make jokes about XYZ or whatever. And I think for me, it's really important to always try to punch up. And I do think that like first and second drafts are there for punching in every direction, right? And not really knowing. And I think that there were moments when I was like going back through and I would be like, who's the joke on in this? And like, is this a joke on like, am I like using the humor of language? Like, and I can like fall into that trap a lot. Like, I really love how something sounds. I love the absurdity of like two words coming together. And I would like realize in the end that actually like that joke is on like a marginalized person or someone who like, or not even a marginalized person, but just someone who like the joke like doesn't need to be in there, right? Or in that form. And I think that something I've been thinking about, I've been talking about it with a good friend from grad school for years, is that there's always like the first joke and like the first thing that comes to mind. And for me, I can tell when my writing is relying only on those first jokes, when I am just being like, oh, this is funny, I'll put it in, I'll keep it in there. And I like look back and was like, that's not like the funniest thing that I could have said, right? Like I can push that a little bit more. I can think about like, what is actually funny about this? And that for me is like the real fun of like revisions, like finding a way to like push it a little bit deeper so that it doesn't sound like, something that like a former editor of mine said is that like a lot of times my dialogue in its first draft, when like I think it's funny, she would say that like it sounds almost like sitcom dialogue. And I think that was an extremely smart insight to have, because like that sort of sitcom dialogue can work, but there's a ceiling to it. And I think I'm constantly trying to raise that ceiling of like how I can make the novel more than like what we would get on a sitcom, right? Like The Office is great, but there are things that, you know, a novel does differently and different ways to sort of get jokes across. And I think if you're not taking advantage of that, then you're wasting novels, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it reads sitcom-y at all in any places. Definitely crashed through that ceiling.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, the sitcom ceiling.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, we read that really powerful theme back to Dyson and Sasha's teenage years. I'd love to hear about how you approach the use of flashbacks, and when you're writing, how you know it's time for a flashback scene.
Yeah, I've been talking with my student. I'm teaching a novel workshop right now, and I have been referring to flashbacks as commercials. I was like, and I'm essentially like, you know, we try to like create as much tension as we possibly can. And then this flashback pays the advertisements, right? Or like pays for the show to stay on the air, right? And like, we need this in order for the exciting stuff to keep happening. And sometimes it can be like boring. There are writers who are like, I don't like flashbacks, I don't go back in time. So essentially, I mean, this sounds sort of cheap, but if I found that I got to what feels sort of like a cliffhanger, and if I like created a question in my main scene that gave me room to write a flashback, right? Or if I found that I was moving forward and there was something that needs answering, or some sort of character dynamic that wasn't being answered, then I would try to include a flashback to begin to answer those questions that I was setting up. So I think it was two things. One, if I felt that there was enough tension in the front story and what was immediately happening in the present tense action, then that would give me the space to move to a flashback, because quite literally the reader would be like, but I want to know what happened, so I guess I will sit through this flashback in the same way that they'll sit through a commercial. And also when there was something that I needed to include to make the next scene work, right? If there was a detail about the two characters that would come up in the next scene, and oftentimes for me, like, I didn't know where the flashbacks went. I had a sense of like, I need to move back in time here. And it felt to me like the arc of the present day story was pretty set in stone over the course of once I had the full draft, that arc was pretty set in stone. What ended up happening was like almost like, you know, tectonic plates beneath, the flashbacks were always shifting around, and I was trying to find I know that these are the things that I need to say, but I don't exactly know where to put them. So a lot of the movement was figuring out where best to put the backstory, where best to align these flashbacks so that they will directly impact the scene that follows. Because I think I was fairly loose in how I was writing them and where I was placing them in like first and second drafts.
That's super interesting. And I never felt like bored when we cut away from the tense moment for the flashback, because the flashbacks are all so engaging and important.
Yeah, very engaging commercials that I've read. Yeah.
Yes, excellent.
Yeah.
When you first started working on this novel, I'm curious where you began and kind of how it took shape over the course of the writing process.
Yeah, so this novel very much began with the relationship between Sasha and Dyson. The earliest forms of what I would call this version of the book were just conversations between the two of them without really knowing. I know that they wanted to like start a cult. I didn't know why, I didn't know what it was about. And that I think is probably a good example of what I was saying earlier when like I find like language funny, like what would it mean for someone to be like, oh, like let's start a cult? Because it was like, you know, all these like cult documentaries that were happening in like 2016, and every time it was the same story. It was people like, we just wanted to create a commune and somehow it became a cult, or like we just wanted to make people happy and then something happened. So I was imagining like, what if people were really like upfront about those desires, right? So that seemed like ironic to me. So I started chasing that language. And I had these characters, and these were two characters who I was thinking about for a long time. I would actually say that the first scene in the book was likely the first time that Dyson and Sasha go back to Dyson's house. That was probably the first thing that I wrote, but in an extremely different form. And I had a excerpt that was actually published in a like small standalone online journal that was like very different. And that was a much more realist story than what I eventually produced. But I think that was that was like the seed of like, I knew that I wanted to write about these two characters and I just need to figure out what their story was. I also published a story through Dyson's perspective that was in the magazine Catapult in 2016. And that too was these two characters in a different situation. And it's almost as if I was trying to like write my own spin-offs or do my own like fan fiction before I realized like what exactly the plot of this was. And so it felt like there were, even though they didn't end up anywhere close to the book, that was a lot of like character work that I was doing without intending to put them into this novel. And then I realized like, I keep coming back to these characters. There's something that I'm like really obsessed with these characters that I can't really get over. So I wanted to dive deeper into that. And then I just realized what I wanted the plot of this book to be. And that just sort of led me in the direction where I went down, yeah. And thankfully I had the characters there to sort of hold it together, rather than it just being like, if it were strictly just the idea, then I don't think it would work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you ever consider writing chapters from Dyson's point of view as well, or was it always going to be Sasha?
Once it became this novel, it was always going to be Sasha.
Mm-hmm.
I think Sasha's story is far more interesting than Dyson's. Sasha is self-aware in ways that Dyson isn't. Mm. Sasha also lacks a lot of self-awareness in many ways, but I think she has a redemption arc that Dyson doesn't in this book. And Dyson is someone who is constantly striving for a redemption and maybe doesn't get it in the same way, or like doesn't even realize that he is striving for a redemption, or like he doesn't really understand the connections that he's striving for and what he's trying to produce. Whereas Sasha is very clear, like she something has happened to her and she wants to get her life back. And she's driven by this desire to get her life back. And she needs to, over the course of the novel, needs to understand the ways in which she has maybe unintentionally wronged other people and maybe not seen people as human as she should have, how she has sort of not given people the, I won't say attention, but maybe like the empathy or the sympathy that they deserve. And also, you know, which isn't to say that I think that she should have been nicer to the man who was harassing her online. I think that it's not that Lucas DeVry guy. I think it's like other people in her life, people who she hasn't like fully seen, which is something that she has to reckon with when she's at the Atmosphere with all the 12 men, of like, how do we begin to see them on a real human level rather than just as like 12 archetypes.
Mm. When you first started writing and were playing around with that idea of friends starting a cult, did you know that there was going to be that kind of flash forward, that it was going to be a successful cult? Or did that surprise you as you wrote?
Yeah, what's weird is that I think for a while that wasn't there. And then strangely, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Wicker Man. I was like really stuck in my draft. And I watched that movie, and it like, the next day I started writing what was the final section of this book. And I wrote it in like 3 days. And it was just like, with, you know, obviously some like editing, but like the first draft of like those final 40 pages came out like really quickly. And I knew what it was going to be. And I think that I love jumps in time. I mean, something that is really interesting is how these, how like ritual gets codified. And that I think is like, was interesting to me, but it was happening on a much smaller scale over the early drafts of this book, in which it was primarily taking place over the few months that Sasha and Dyson were together at the camp. However, once I realized that I could, you know, just move outside of the small window that I'd given myself at the Atmosphere, then that gave me a lot of freedom to think about like how things would eventually be digested into like actual ritual and actual practice. And that became like really fun for me to think about like what would happen to these things after X many years, after like playing telephone with like the things that Dyson had said, and like with, you know, however many different people had like filtered through the cult. Yeah.
Yeah, that scene at the end in the mall with the Sherlock room that was an escape room had me chuckling. I loved that ritual, and all of that was great.
Thank you.
So we have time for one more question. I don't know if anyone has questions they want to throw in the chat or the Q&A box, or I have more questions, but I'll give our attendees a second if you want to pop anything in there. In the meantime, I'll ask one. Were there any inspirations outside of writing while you were working on the novel?
Yeah. I mean, I inspiration, I would say a lot of the movies and documentaries that were coming out about cults were like I said, The Wicker Man, which is a horror movie from the 70s. There was a Nicolas Cage remake, I think in like 2001, which I haven't seen. But movies like that. And I think I would say that horror movies were actually a huge influence, and it's only sort of retroactively become clear to me how they were. And I think that there was a great deal. I think I tried to create a lot of tension through atmosphere in the book. And I realized sort of looking back that like how I was like trying to do that through imagery and through the sort of emptiness of scene, and like horror movies were like playing a huge role in that. I think there's a movie called The Endless that came out a couple years ago that was like a really big influence for that. So any sort of like really quiet, creepy movies were huge for me in thinking about this. And this band Forest Swords, I listened to one of their albums a lot, like on repeat. That seemed to be like the right tone for me of like really figuring out like what is seemed really tonally precise and trying to get into the groove to write this book. So I would say like movies and music were a huge influence for me. while I was writing
Yeah, the
this.
tone definitely feels so ominous while reading it, like edge of your seat, you know something bad's gonna happen. And definitely see the horror movie influence.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dan, are we at time or should I ask one more? Okay, Dan says one more. What are you reading lately? Any books or authors that you'd recommend?
Yeah, let's see. So right now I'm reading Patrick Nathan's Image Control, which comes out in 2 weeks and is excellent. So I'd highly recommend that. I just started reading The Margot Affair by Sine Lemoine, and that's really great. Pop Song by Larissa Pham is really excellent as well. What else? Oh, and I picked up Alexandra Kleeman's book today, Something New Under the Sun, and Jean Thornton's Summer Fun, which came out last week. I started reading that a couple weeks ago. Both of those are really excellent, and can't really go wrong with any one of those books. Yeah.
Awesome, great list.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Yeah.
Thank you, that was great. Thank you to Alex, thank you to Emily. Buy the book, the link is in the chat. I want to thank our funders. There they are. A video of this reading will be on our website, wab.org, as well as our upcoming readings. And I want to say thank you and have a great night.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Dan, again. All right, take care.